Okay, welcome back to my second installment that's all about this wonderful $10 device called a gray card that can really improve your videos. I've already covered white balance and how you can use this wonderful tool to help you set the correct white balance, but I wanted to dedicate this video talking about exposure, which is really the primary function of a gray card. So let's talk about exposure. Why is it important? Well, obviously you want to set the correct exposure for your scene. Depending on the type of camera you have and the dynamic range capabilities of that camera, you may have to make a couple of sacrifices. For example, if you're trying to expose for your subject, but you're in a very bright environment, your highlights may be overexposed. Now, ideally, you want to have a good range where you still have your highlights, you still retain the details in the shadows, and you can get your subject, which if you're shooting a person, for example, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. That's ideally what you want, is a nice spread. And to some degree, yes, that does kind of depend on your camera. If you're shooting with a cinema camera, for example, they're known for the dynamic range. You can recover a lot of the shadows or the highlights and so forth. Well, the gray card is gonna heavily rely on zebras. Most cameras out there today have zebras. IRE is a unit to help you measure light for videos. And it was actually developed by a really famous black and white photographer, Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams divided the IRE light spectrum into a very convenient chart that measures from 0 to 10. 0 meaning that there's absolutely no light or there's absence of light, it's darkness, and 10 meaning that there's plenty of light and it's almost white. The Ansel Adams zone system is also very convenient because it references things per each individual zone as he divided them up. For example, you will find a lot of references to skin tones, which is incredibly important in film and cinematography. You'll also find some references to like wood and other objects to give you an idea of what that zone is kind of covering. Now, this is where the gray card comes into play, because the gray card is going to represent that neutral zone. 50 or 5 on the spectrum. And if you look up 5 or 50% on the spectrum, you'll find that it's also representing skin tones. Now there's different levels of skin tones. Not everybody's the same. There's darker skin tones, lighter skin tones, but that 50% marker will give you a great starting reference that you can then change and customize per the subject. So let me show you guys how to set exposure. So my camera choice for today is the Sony a7S III, and I already have zebras set up as a quick access functions in my menu functions, and you can toggle them on and off, or I can go to the custom settings and actually, pick a preset or pick my own custom settings. The Sony a7S III has several different presets that you can pick from 70 all the way up to 100 plus. So if you're exposing for the highlights, for example, you can choose one of those. But today we're going to look at the custom settings. I've already set up custom number 2 for my particular skin tone, which is roughly around 65% plus or minus 5. I have found that that works best with my skin tone, and I have it as a custom setting. So for today's demonstration, I'm going to use custom settings 1 to show you how to set your exposure using the gray card, and we're going to set the lower limit to 50%. If we take a look at the zebras on the camera and my key light set at 100%, which is my main light, you can see that the gray card has shown us that we are overexposed for skin tones. If we dial it back, we're definitely going to be in the ballpark range, so it's a great starting point. I also own the Atomos Ninja 5, which is a great external monitor that also has zebras. If you take a look at the monitor, which I think is a little bit more accurate than the camera, you can also see that we are overexposed for skin tones on the gray card. So we've already covered indoors, which is a controlled environment, but what happens if you're trying to set up exposure using a gray card in an outdoor setting or more in a real world scenario where you have highlights and shadows and you're trying to find that balance with your skin tone? Well, we are outside right now. It is 12 o'clock, which is the worst case condition. The sun is directly on top of us and we're gonna get blown out highlights, and we're going to try to set our exposure to get our face and really expose me, the subject. But what you have to understand is exposure is a compromise between your highlights, your shadows, and your intended subject. This is still very useful, and I'm going to show you how to set your exposure in an outdoor setting right now. Okay, so it's really the same concept here. We have our white balance and zebras set. You can see that the zebras are indicating that the entire scene is overexposed right now. We are outside, so that is typical. We're going to dial it back until the gray card shows the proper exposure. So right now I am sacrificing my highlights to make sure my subject, which is a human, which is myself, is properly exposed. And for demonstration purposes, when using the Atomos Ninja, I'm just showing you guys that you can also set your zebras to 50% and you're going to get the same results. But again, we are sacrificing the highlights in order to get the proper exposure for the skin tones at 50%. But if I'm being honest with you guys, if I have access to waveforms or false colors, I'm going to use that over zebras. But that's usually a cinema camera feature. Okay, now you can see that when we were in the opposite side where the sun's directly shining at me, even though I set the exposure properly, and again, 50% is generally where you want to be for skin tones or for a subject, a human subject, it was still way too dark and I was in the shadows and, you know, it just didn't look right. When we switched the camera backwards and now we're facing, the sun's actually behind us, right? You can see that the gray card worked really, really, really well and we got great exposure. And that's because you have to find that compromise. So I usually have my zebras around 65% or so, plus or minus 5. And I've found that that works really good for me, for my skin tones. But you want to set your zebras to 50% when you're using the gray card. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and I will catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody.